So one of the reasons in the last video I talked about just trying to let go and accept that you can have a square root of a negative number. You just need to make up a different symbol to take care of that. And we use I for that symbol. And now I want to talk about just sort of what are some of the things you can do with that concept there. And so what I want to do is talk about how we have a real number line, and usually we represent that as going horizontally. And then what we can do is imagine that there are all these other numbers that live up and down from there. And what we can start doing is noticing what happens when we take numbers that are on the real number line and on the imaginary number line. So let's do just a few examples first. The number 2 just sits right here. That's the number 2. You can think of it as an arrow pointing from the origin 2 steps to the right. The number -3, similarly, just goes 3 steps to the left. Any imaginary number would go straight up and down on the vertical axis, kind of like the y-axis. So for example, right here, this is the square root of -1. In other words, it's just an arrow pointing 1 step up and down. If I wanted to go, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps down, that would be -5 square root of -1, or -5i, like that. You can represent that with an arrow going 5 steps down. Now you can also take real numbers and imaginary numbers and squish them together to make what are called complex numbers. So let's look at an example of, say, 2 plus I. 2 plus I means I go 2 steps to the right and 1 step up. So this arrow right here, this point right here, is 2 plus I. Notice that the way I got to 2 plus I is I just added the 2 arrows together. 2 steps right, 1 step up, that's 2 plus I. Similarly, I could draw an arrow right down here, and that would represent -3 minus 5i. I can get there either by going along my -3 arrow and then along my -5i arrow, or I can go down my -5i arrow and go over like this. So really, this idea of representing complex numbers visually is pretty intuitive. It's just like adding arrows together on a map. And you can even take your 2 complex number arrows and add them together. If I did, for example, 2 plus I, and I added -3 minus 5i, I would end up with -1 minus 4i. -1 minus 4i is an arrow that goes right down here. And you can see how that can be achieved either by taking my -3 minus 5i arrow and connecting it like that, or by taking my 2 plus I arrow and connecting it right there. You end up at the same place. So adding and subtracting complex numbers is just taking arrows and sticking them tip to tail. What we're going to work on next is how do we multiply complex numbers, and that's where things get really interesting. So please comment if you have any questions.